Well, I think and I think it's really important to understand to some degree origins. And one of the very fascinating things that some friends and I have found in the last few years is how sophisticated some of the earlier rods were. Now, bamboo rods really came into their own in the last 25 years, really last 20 years of the 19th century. And they lasted pretty much as the primary material. I mean, it's arguable to say until the Second World War, and then fiberglass came out, but really they were the best casting, certainly the best technical fishing rods until graphite comes on the scene in the late 70s, mid to late 70s. And suddenly you had a very good light casting rod that was more accessible in many ways, and in some ways more durable, in other ways not quite so. But graphite rods are very much responsible for a lot of the boom in the fly fishing, the sport of fly fishing, certainly in the 80s and until today. When I was young, I'm old enough to know that, or old enough to have been part of the generation where a good bamboo rod was the rod of choice, not as a as a status symbol, but simply it was the best casting rod for the type of fishing that most of us did. Certainly in the East, which was dry fly, and light nymph fishing, surface and near surface techniques. And I washed dishes in a sweaty old restaurant to buy my first one in the mid 70s. As graphite came along, bamboo rods kind of were relegated to a few aficionados. And what really changed me was when I started going to the West, and the amount of stress we'd put on rods. And as graphite was much lighter and we were using heavier rods, I really switched to graphite rods. That being said, I didn't get rid of some of the good rods I'd had early on in my career. And then when my focus shifted back east about 20 years ago, after having spent quite a bit of time in the West and living out there and so on, as I started to come back east, I fell in with my old friends who were either rod builders or rod aficionados. And I started looking at cane rods again, not just from a collector standpoint, but from a fishing standpoint. And where to me, and the graphite rod is a wonderful tool, but it seems to be just that, a tool. I've never developed a real, let's say, relationship with graphite rods. You use them up, or you break, and you get another one. There's not that a feeling of almost a partnership with a rod. Now, I don't want to go too far. And some people say, well, a rod that's caught on graphite isn't proper, or a fish that's caught on graphite isn't properly caught. I'm never going to say that. Okay, I've caught many proper fish on graphite, and I hope to catch many more. It's simply a choice of tool in certain situations. But that being said, a well-designed bamboo rod in some situations can be absolutely the best tool for the job. And I find that, especially in lower water conditions, that I've gone back to preferring a good bamboo rod over graphite. They have a certain, everybody talks about this feel that they have. A friend of mine says it's almost impossible to break a fish off on a good cane rod because of the way the rods handle stress. And if you're fishing in very thin water, especially for larger fish in summer conditions, the last thing you really want to do is break that fish off. So they can actually be a bit of an advantage. Now, your initial question was kind of the history of these rods. Well, one of the very fascinating things that we've found is that especially the Catskills were a driving force in the design and development of very sophisticated tapers and cane rods. And the Leonard Rod Company, which produced more high-quality American rods than any other company, and was in business from the early 1870s through 1984. And I remember going down there when I was young and, marveling at all the rods in the shop, and occasionally, having enough money to buy one, and they were very fine rods. But Leonard, with its proximity, it was on the Hudson in what's the name of the town? And not Highland Mills, but anyway, they were over on the Hudson. So they're right at the doorstep to the Catskills. And they developed rods for these Catskill anglers who were, in a lot of cases, fishing very sophisticated techniques, especially in the summer. There's not a lot written about this until you start scratching the surface and looking for it. And people like Ed Hewitt and some of these others were using very, very tiny flies in low, clear water and having rods developed exactly for those techniques. So Leonard was building extremely sophisticated, light line, lightweight rods very early on. Now, some of these rods, they were very, very well designed, and they were very beautifully constructed. And occasionally you find one that's in good fishable condition, and they're absolutely marvels of casting ability. They feel different to a modern angler, where a lot of the later cane rods were what were called dry fly actions, very fast action rods. And after graphite came out, a lot of the contemporary rods were designed in a lot of ways to compete with graphite in terms of casting, which is kind of defeats the purpose of cane. A lot of the early rods had much softer actions. Now, soft doesn't necessarily mean sloppy or poor casting, but when one realizes that they were using gut leaders and gut tippets, and as fine as 6X. Now, a 6X gut tippet didn't test in pounds, it tested in ounces, maybe 5 or 6 ounces. So they needed rods that would protect very, very tippets that would be much finer in breaking strength than anything we'd consider using today. So these guys were playing the game at a very high level. And they were obviously rods designed to fish small flies and very light leaders and so forth. And I have here, I don't know how well this is going to show up, but this is a Leonard rod from the 1920s. And I was very fortunate to find this rod a few years ago because it's in essentially new unfished condition. And this is an 8-foot Leonard Catskill. Catskill was one of their model designations, and it was in a lot of ways their most popular rods. This is an 8-foot 3-piece rod that weighs 2.5 ounces. Now, this rod was built 95 years ago, almost 100 years ago. So the level of sophistication in these rods at that time was very high, and this rod would be perfectly suitable for fishing, say, the Willowee in August today. And it's exactly what they were doing back then. So they weren't a bunch of, they weren't building, just fish poles back then. They were building very, very sophisticated rods. And through the Catskill series, which lasted many, many years. Now, this rod also has full intermediate wraps, which adds about 1/4 ounce to a given rod. So, stripped down to modern weights, this rod would be barely over 2 ounces. So they were, they were really designing some incredible rods back then. When Leonard was reorganized, now the Catskill series was cataloged for many years, and then was dropped as a series in the 1970s. But when Leonard was reorganized and Tom Maxwell came on from Thomas and Thomas, and Tom was was one of the great rod builders, one of the great bamboo rod minds of all time. And I knew Tom a very little bit. I spoke to him a few times, but didn't know him as well as I wished I had. And he unfortunately passed away at a relatively young age. But Tom was a master rod designer, and he understood the aesthetic of the earlier rods. So he reintroduced the Catskill series of rods with more modernized tapers, but still with that lightness and aesthetic. And I happen to have a real weakness for Maxwell era Catskill rods, and they're fairly rare. So when they come out, I sell a kidney or whatever I need to do to get the next one. Now I obviously can't buy every one I see, but a while back, there's kind of like, for a lot of people, there's a holy grail if you're a collector, and God forbid you're a collector, because it's a horrible disease. You can see the books behind me that constitute a very, very small portion of my fishing books. But books and rods are the big disease. But Tom Maxwell reinstated the Catskill series. And this is a rod which would be analogous to the one that I just showed you. It's an 8-foot 3-piece rod in the same genre. Now it's a little bit heavier. It's about a half an ounce heavier. It tips at just over a little bit over 3 ounces. It's a little bit stronger action, but the design elements, the fine tips, the minimalized fittings, the very plain aesthetic are all inherent. And this is a rod I fish a lot. This was kind of the holy grail of rods that I was looking for, this 3-piece 8-foot 4-weight Catskill that unfortunately very few were made. But it's an absolutely wonderful fishing rod. And I've caught some very large fish with it. And it's a rod that I bought used, of course, and it had obviously had a bit of a history. So the previous owner probably caught a lot of fish on it too. The point I'm making there is these things over time can be quite durable. We think of them as being fragile, and they're actually not. I've fished a lot of rods that are, now getting on to 75 and 80 years old. And then talking to rod builders about the construction of these rods, there's no reason that they shouldn't last that long. The techniques and the materials that they use. Yeah, sure.
I have a question about the sort of techniques of building. Did they check over the time between those early rods, that first rod you showed us that was almost 100 years old, and the second rod that was built in, did you say it was built in the 70s or?
This was built in 1979.
Yeah. Year I was born.
So let's say there's a 50-year difference there.
Had those techniques changed at all? I mean, I've been in rod makers' workshops before, and it feels like there's a traditional technique at play, and that there's a craftsmanship that goes into the building of them that perhaps is completely related to how they were built back then. Is that true?
That is true, and that's a question I'm going to answer in 2 parts. The 2 Leonards that I showed you were built using a lot of the same machinery. In terms of a 50-year difference. Now, unfortunately, when Bob Taylor's rod shop burned late last year, the original Leonard bevelers from the 1800s perished with it. And Bob was building rods on this, so 130 years later, using the same machinery. So yes, and the design of a lot of the machinery to cut the strips is exactly the same as it would have been 100 years ago, and the basic techniques have not changed. Probably the two things that have changed the most were the introduction of radical hollow building, which I'll talk about in just a second, and in some cases the use of different adhesives, synthetic adhesives, where the earlier rods were put together with essentially a hide glue, very similar to the Elmer's glue that you probably have in your in your toolbox. Talking to rod makers, very knowledgeable rod makers about that, because I'd always had some worries about older rods that had been constructed with hide glue. And they said, as long as the rod hasn't been compromised in terms of the varnish scratches where water can enter into the seams, they see no difference in terms of longevity of a hide glued rod over a synthetic glued rod. And this isn't just, this is actual testing they've gone through and so forth. When you think about a Stradivarius violin, now violins are held together with hide glue, which is made from rabbit hide rather than cowhide. But they're still performing flawlessly 400 years later. And one of the magic things about a violin is that it's so repairable because of that, where they haven't been put together with nails or screws. So that kind of says something, about hide glue. So it really changed. Understanding that really changed my opinion of older rods, and older rods that previously I probably would have passed on in terms of acquiring them to fish with. Kind of that. That assurance from very knowledgeable builders that this is indeed a very durable form of construction, which opens up the door to a lot of people that might want to get into owning a good rod, because a lot of these older rods, that aren't collector grade, but still may be very, very functional, whether they're original condition or refinished by a knowledgeable refinisher, can put a very good, very fishable rod in the hands of somebody for not much more than what a high quality graphite costs today. And right now is, in terms of adjusted dollars, there is no better time to buy a good cane rod than right now, because in a lot of cases, dollar for dollar, these rods are being offered less than they were 20 and 30 years ago. So when you adjust for inflation, there's, the numbers can still look high. And for collectible rods, unfortunately, I think it's like anything that's collectible. Somebody says painting, and they paid 45 million for a Van Gogh. Well, that's one painting. That's not the hundreds of thousands of other very good paintings that traded hands at very affordable prices. And I think the same is true with cane rods. People hear, what Garrisons and Paynes and Gillams go for. Those are anomalies. Those numbers are simply put out there to shock the unsuspecting public. One can buy a very, very good fishable rod today for around $1,000, which will last them a good long time and give them a lot of enjoyment. That same rod 20 years ago, maybe even double that in 20 years ago dollars. So they're actually quite affordable today. Now back to the earlier question, where how have techniques changed? There's some rods being produced today, and I will say unequivocally that the very finest bamboo rods ever produced, for a number of reasons, are the ones being built today. Simply the accumulation of knowledge about building, about tapers, about construction, and so forth, is there. The access to information. Now, a lot of the earlier builders, the legend was that only 2 or 3 people could enter the room where the Leonard Beveler was, because they didn't want the technology stolen, and that Payne did all the varnishing himself, and would not allow anyone to varnish the rods. And Payne rods are known as probably the finest varnished shop rods of all time. And when you look at an original pane, it's an absolute marvel. And even the best rod makers today who can do incredible finishes still try to emulate pane. Again, Stradivarius is kind of often brought up, when pane is spoken about. But some people got questioning how far they could push the performance of rods, and a lot of this happened on the West Coast with companies like Powell and Winston, where they began hollow building the rods. Because the center of a rod doesn't do anything more than kind of hold the rod together through the surface area of the glue. The center of a rod is primarily softer wood, softer pith. If you can take that out, you can take out a lot of the weight. Whenever you take weight out of a rod, especially towards the tip, you get a much more efficient rod. The energy is put not into bending dead weight, but into accelerating the line. And this is one of the reasons that a hollow graphite rod is such an efficient casting tool, because they're very light. And all of that energy that you put into the rod translates out into casting the line. And that's one place that graphite really does shine. So you get people a few years back, people like particularly Per Brandon, who had spent some time on the West Coast, began building rods, looked at rods by Powell and Winston, and started to push the limits on what one can do with a hollow built rod. Now, Per is one of the finest rod builders who's ever lived, and he was a tournament caster for many years, and you often see him at the competitions at the center. Per started being a bit of an iconoclast. Per wanted to see how far he could push bamboo rods in terms of casting competitions, and to do this, it was hollow building he thought was the path to this, and he was pretty much right. So what Per was doing was taking hollow building kind of to the next level, and hollow building rods very radically, and able to reduce the weight of those rods. So now you're taking bamboo rods, which once you get over 6 feet in a solid built rod, rods tend to get awful heavy. And when you add to that the fact that a lot of rods were pretty much dressed up with heavy fittings and large grips and so forth like that, to add kind of some curb appeal to them, to the buyer. But again, it goes back to the Catskill rods, where they stripped everything off that didn't need to be there in order to lower the weight. You can do that another way. You can make short rods, which were very, very popular when I was getting started. Right down to the ultimate 4-footers. And there was a 5-foot rod that I wanted like nothing else in the world. And finally, actually, as an adult, I got one, and I owned it for a week before I sold it to somebody I didn't like, because it was the most horrible thing I'd ever, these 6-foot rods that were kind of the norm when I was a kid are just horribly inefficient, but they didn't weigh much. So everybody was on this weight gain. But again, modern builders have stripped the weight out of a rod through more mechanical means. So now what we're getting is rods that are that match graphite in length and weight as well. Per's rods are I have some Per's rods, but he went on, and Per's a very generous guy and has shared a lot of his knowledge with people like Chris Vance, and who builds a very, very fine rod, and Tim Abbott, who's instrumental in the center. You see Tim a lot at the center. I just cast a new rod by Tim just this last week. It was one of the most impressive fly rods, not just bamboo rods, but fly rods I've ever cast. And Tim I call Tim the wizard. I mean, Tim can do anything. But another one who's been a real leader in this, and was one of the first of pairs, I don't want to say disciples, is Leon Hansen in Michigan. And Leon is building absolutely radically lightweight, long rods. This is an 8-foot, 8-inch, 4-weight in 3-piece that weighs 3.2 ounces. This is graphite weight in a bamboo rod. And 20 years ago, this would have been thought impossible. And this is a rod that is perfectly suitable for fishing large rivers. So if you like the aesthetic of bamboo, you can have it in a rod that matches graphite, not only in performance, but in weight. And if you were to pick up this butt section, if I handed you this, you wouldn't know that I hadn't handed you a section of a graphite rod. So there's really, really, and these aren't the only guys. The guys I mentioned aren't the only ones. There are really cool things going on in the world of bamboo today. And for those of us who are kind of following this, it's really a fun time, because we're seeing like this renaissance of design of bamboo that, financially, unfortunately, I just can't keep up with. It's just like I want. And the other things in my life are saying you can't have.
I wanted to see where this one fits in, because this is the one that we're going to raffle off.
Okay, sure.
Here, I'll show you there.
Let's see, Hardy Palicona, 7.5, 3 3/8. That was the exact, and who knows, that could be the one. That was the first good bamboo rod that I owned, was exactly that model.
Really?
And I may have to bid on it, just because I sold it many years ago and have kicked myself ever since.
Oh, wow. Really?
Very sweet rod.
Look, I'm going to show it to you so that you can.
Yeah.
Because where does Hardy fit in that sort of the cycle or the progress and development of these bamboo rods?
Well, this is a very interesting story, and certainly I think it's fairly well known that I have a close association with Hardy and have for many years. Hardy built more quality bamboo rods than any other maker in the world. That's the classic Hardy, the classic Hardy Palicona. They were wonderful rods. The real fitting is what's known as the Hardy's patent W fitting. You can see that the pocket cap forms almost a W if you look at it flat on. It forms a kind of a W shape. Interesting thing about this is that the English rods were always heavier. And then in the early 1900s, American anglers, American expatriates, and Americans who had connection with especially the Fly Fishers Club of London began showing up with Leonard rods. And the Leonard rods weighed about half of what the contemporary British rods did. It was almost axiomatic that a British rod weighed about 1 ounce to the foot. So if you can imagine a 10-foot rod weighing, the better part of 1 pound, these breakers. So now Americans show up. Now the thing about English fly fishing, especially at that time, was it was a lot less democratic than fly fishing was in the American scene. So these were generally well-off gentlemen that fly fished, especially on the chalk streams. Well, here come these Americans. Now they've got 9-foot rods and 10-foot rods that don't weigh 4 ounces, built by Leonard, and it just blows them away. To the point where there was all this controversy in the angling press over there, where the letters were going back and forth about how these rods aren't going to stand up and so on and so forth, which was patently not the case. And that George Edward Mackenzie Skews, the great emancipator of the nymph, and probably the greatest angling mind of the 20th century, and a tremendous hero of mine through his writings, and how much he influenced fly fishing on both sides of the Atlantic. Was a very early adapter or adopter of these rods, to the point where, it weren't quite threats on his life, but, there were a lot of people that didn't like him. But to be a chalk stream angler in the 19 teens and 20s, having a Leonard rod was the mark of being a very knowledgeable angler. Well, this prompted companies like Hardy to develop rods that matched the performance and the weights of the American rods. And so you see rods coming out of Hardy and Farlow's that were, matched them in terms of weight and performance. And Hardy produced some absolutely wonderful rods, the Fairchild and the Fairy series, that were as good as anything being produced over here at that time. But the British, and this is nothing against the British, tended to be a bit slower in changing their taste in rods. And for a lot of British anglers, one rod might have to serve a lot of purposes. And the other thing that you didn't have in the British rod industry were the smaller makers that America had. Individual makers like Gillum and Garrison, and small factories like Payne and Leonard and Winston, and so forth. And with the British class system, when you bought your tackle, depending on where you were in that hierarchy of classes, it was Hardy at the top, and then Farlow, and then, and you worked your way down. But you would never have come in contact with the actual makers themselves. You would have come in contact with maybe the Hardy brothers, who held many royal warrants, and had, I still remember the old Hardy shop at 61 Pall Mall in London when I was there many years ago, which hadn't changed since the 1920s with the creaky wooden floors. So you didn't deal directly with the maker. Now here in the U.S., that was, we're arguably a more egalitarian society. You could go to Paul Young. You could be a captain of industry, as a lot of the Paul Young was in Detroit. So he had all the trade from the automobile barons, as it were, and they would go to Paul Young's shop and hang out, and he'd help design rods for their. So I think you saw a lot more different type of development in the States outside of our geography, where certainly the Northeast and the Catskills and the Poconos are very different than the angling situations or problems that one would run into in, say, Michigan or the Rockies or the West Coast. But that being said, and back to that rod, Hardy has always had a very strong following in the United States, and starting in the 50s and 60s, certainly after the Second World War, they began designing rods that were much more suitable for the American market. And the 7.5 foot rod that you have there is a prime example of that. It was a very, very popular rod, and very much to American taste. And they're wonderful casting little rods, beautifully built, and in a lot of cases they were a real bargain, because their production costs were much lower. But great little rod.
I have a question for you. Perhaps to sort of to finish off, what do you, that this is obviously something that's changed over the course of years. The way that people fish, the tools that they use have changed and adapted, but there seems to be some consistency in the development, building, and use of the cane rods. How do you see that going forward? What do you have any sort of idea about how that might develop in the future? And for people who are just getting into the sport, what is the beauty of a bamboo rod that might set it apart? What are the sort of simple sort of elements of it that make it a kind of interesting tool to have in your in your locker?
Well, in a lot of cases, let's start with this. I think that the future of the bamboo rod is a lot on firmer ground than it was 20 years ago. I think a lot of that is through social media, through people being able to communicate, about these rods. There are more builders than there ever have been, which I have some opinion on. I can see this as a good thing, and in some cases not such a good thing. I don't want to see people confused. Not every bamboo rod is a treasure. Not every bamboo rod is a great rod. And in fact, there's every bit as many bad rods as there are good ones. That being said, that a good rod not only is a wonderful fishing tool, and they're actually a lot of people think they're an expert's tool or they're harder to cast somehow. They're actually more forgiving. They distribute stress differently. They absorb stress differently. In fact, if I was going to start someone casting, I'd just as soon start them with a bamboo rod as with a graphite rod. There's no mystery in how they cast. They do have their limitations. And for someone who is going to cast a long distance or is going to use heavily weighted flies, you can risk damage to them. And not because they're more fragile, but because they simply weren't designed for that. We could design a rod to fish, strike indicators and bead heads, and a lot of people do. But I don't think you'd really want to subject a bamboo rod to that kind of stress. In terms of the less tangible aspects, a bamboo rod it doesn't have a lot of visual impact, but when you look at it closely, it's a very beautiful thing. And it's the product in a lot more ways of someone's, in a lot of cases, someone's real passion. A good single maker rod. Generally, these guys are very driven to this. And if you've ever seen the film Chasing the Taper, you see this with these guys. And I know, I'm not trying to drop names, but all of those people are friends of mine. And I've known them for many, many years. And, you see that every one of them would have probably done much better at something else in life, but these things became a passion, and to produce, these very, I hesitate to say works of art, but very, very beautiful artifacts that are very purpose-driven, and that really perform within their design parameters as well or better than anything else. I have a rod that I have a couple rods that have been through me through most of my life. I have one, and I talked about going to the Leonard factory when I was a kid in my 20s, and picking up a rod. Now that was in March of 1980, so it's 40 years old. And the rod's been everywhere with me, and it's as good as the day I bought it. And it's one of the it's one of the it's one of the things it's been with me through thick and thin. It's a companion. I'm not somebody, again, I don't feel that, I'll say this again, I don't feel that a rod that's caught on graphite isn't proper, or a fish that's caught on graphite isn't properly caught. I'm not saying that at all. Graphite's a wonderful, wonderful tool. And it's really the reason that probably most of us are sitting here, because graphite made casting more available to a lot of people, made fishing more available to a lot of people. But one of the things about a cane rod is that it is an opportunity for someone of very modest means to own the best of something. I've always wanted a Ferrari. I don't know why. What would I do with a Ferrari? I'd kill myself with it. But you think of a Ferrari as the pinnacle of the automobile maker's art. And I'll never have one. I mean, it's so far out of my reach. But I can own a rod by someone like Mark Aaron or Bob Taylor, or any of a number, any of number of other people. And it's the very best of something. It's available to the average person, and I can take it out and I can use it. And then I can call these guys up and say, you got to see the fish I caught on your rod the other day. So you have this, this wonderful connection in a lot of cases with the builders. Or if you're more historically minded, you can fish with a rod that was made in the 70s, the 60s, the 50s, the 40s, the 30s, the 20s, and have a very similar experience to that original owner. So there's this kind of metaphysical connection, which, and overall fly fishing transcends time. We are so similar to anglers of 100 or even 200 years ago. The only thing that's changed in a lot of cases is the tackle. And for, let's say, a Catskill angler from the golden age to the Catskill angler from today's golden age, the only thing that would be different might be the line and leader material, where before it was silk and silkworm gut, and today it's synthetics. The same rods, the same reels are absolutely valid today, not only in terms of aesthetics, but of performance. And so, there I see this wonderful historical continuity that, again, puts us in touch with what fly fishing has really always been. And that's a sport that's based on aesthetics. It's not the most efficient way to catch fish, but neither is golf the most efficient way to put a ball in a hole. So they're very similar in that. Fly fishing is about not the results, but how you achieve those results. It's about playing the game, and the bamboo rod can add an element to that that a synthetic rod may not.
That's amazing, John. I mean, that is a masterclass.
So, well, it's simply my opinions, but other people may disagree with me.
Maybe.
And who knows? I'll probably get hate mail. I don't know, but
I can't imagine how. No, it's fascinating. I mean, this is an element of the sport that feels so pertinent and so kind of central to how things work, and I feel like when we get into those kind of details, understanding it from that over that period of time of transition and making the connections to the past is how we understand what we're doing now. So what you did there was make those connections in a masterful way. So I really appreciate that.